I knew something was off the second I opened my HOA bill. The number at the bottom was nearly double what I usually paid. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe an accounting error. But when I called the HOA office, I was greeted with the shrill, condescending voice of Karren Whitmore, our neighborhood's self-appointed queen and HOA president. "Jessica," she sighed, like I was a child who had just spilled milk on her pristine white carpet. "The board voted to increase dues. It's all in the best interest of the community." "Funny," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't remember any meeting about this. When exactly did this vote happen?" Karren hesitated for only a second before her voice turned sugary sweet. "Oh, it was a special session. Emergency circumstances. You know how these things work." I did know how these things worked. And I knew for a fact that any increase in dues required a formal vote with all homeowners notified in advance. Karren had pulled this out of thin air, hoping no one would question her. "Send me the meeting minutes," I said flatly. Karren chuckled. "Oh, Jessica, you don't need to trouble yourself with all that legalese. Just pay your dues like everyone else, and there won't be any issues." That was all I needed to hear. I hung up without another word and pulled out my HOA bylaws. I had never been one to let people push me around, and I certainly wasn't going to start now. If Karren thought she could bleed me and my neighbors dry without consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't just going to fight this, I was going to end it. The next day, I started knocking on doors. Peter, my next-door neighbor, was the first to answer. He was a retired firefighter who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. When I told him about the sudden fee hike, his face darkened. "She pulled this nonsense before," he muttered, "back when she first got on the board. We shut it down, but she always finds new ways to squeeze people." "Not this time," I said. Peter wasn't the only one furious. In less than an hour, I had spoken to 10 other homeowners, all of whom had received the same inflated bill. None of them had been notified of a vote. The more people I talked to, the clearer it became Karren had made this decision all on her own, without any legal authority. But she had underestimated something important: me. I wasn't just going to challenge her. I was going to dismantle her entire empire. I spent the next morning digging through the HOA bylaws. I wanted to be absolutely certain before I made my next move. After combing through every section, I found exactly what I was looking for. Any increase in fees required a formal vote with at least 75% homeowner approval. Not only that, but the board had to notify all residents at least 30 days in advance. Karren had ignored every single requirement. With that knowledge in hand, I drafted a formal letter demanding proof of the vote. I wasn't going into this battle alone, either. I had already spoken to 16 homeowners, all of whom were furious about the sudden increase. By the afternoon, I had nearly 24 signatures backing my demand. I hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office. The moment I stepped inside, I was met with the sight of Karren sitting behind a sleek mahogany desk, typing away at her computer like she was the CEO of some massive corporation, instead of a glorified neighborhood busybody. She barely glanced up before sighing dramatically. "Jessica, I really don't have time for this." I placed the letter directly in front of her. "I'm requesting official documentation of the vote," I said. "You have 48 hours to provide proof that this increase was legally approved by the homeowners." She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "I don't owe you anything," I smiled. "Actually, you do. It's in the bylaws. If you refuse, I'll be forced to take legal action." For the first time, she hesitated. It was only for a second, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, her usual arrogance returned. "Fine. I'll get you the documents." I knew she wouldn't. So I prepared for what I knew was coming next. 48 hours passed without a single document from Karren. No emails, no phone calls, not even a flimsy excuse. I wasn't surprised. She had no proof because there had never been a vote. I had already anticipated this move, so I went straight to the county clerk's office. If there had been a legitimate change to the HOA fees, there would be public records. After a quick search, I confirmed what I already suspected: no amendments had been filed. Karren had fabricated the entire thing. With this new evidence, I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. When I laid everything out, he let out a low whistle. "This is bad," he said. "For her, how bad?" She violated multiple statutes, committed fraud by charging unauthorized fees, and if she's been doing this for years, there could be a serious legal case against the HOA itself. That was exactly what I needed to hear. I hired him on the spot and had him draft a legal demand letter outlining every violation. This time, Karren wouldn't be able to ignore it. When the letter was delivered, Karren lost whatever composure she had left. She called an emergency HOA meeting the very next evening, hoping to do damage control. What she didn't realize was that I had already turned the entire neighborhood against her. The meeting was held in the community center, and by the time I arrived, the room was packed. Homeowners filled every chair, with even more standing along the walls. The tension was thick, but Karren still carried herself with an air of superiority as she took her place at the front. "I understand there has been some confusion regarding the recent fee adjustments," she began. I stood before she could spew any more nonsense. "There's no confusion," I said. "You illegally raised fees without a vote, without notice, and without filing the proper amendments with the county." A murmur spread through the crowd. Karren's expression tightened. "You don't understand how these things work, Jessica." I pulled out a folder and held it up. "Actually, I do. These are the bylaws, county filings, and legal statutes outlining why what you did is illegal. And this," I held up the letter from my lawyer, "is the formal legal complaint that will be filed against the HOA if this isn't rectified immediately." The room erupted into full-blown chaos. Homeowners were shouting, demanding answers, demanding refunds. Karren's face turned the color of spoiled milk. Peter, the retired firefighter, stood up. "I motion for a vote of no confidence in this board." Someone else shouted, "Seconded." Karren's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You can't do this," she screeched. But we could, and we did. By the end of the night, Karren and her cronies were removed from the HOA board, but I wasn't finished yet. What she had done wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And I was going to make sure she faced real consequences. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone she had ever taken advantage of. Karren had been dethroned, but I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. She had spent years abusing her power, bleeding homeowners dry with fraudulent fees, and intimidating anyone who dared to question her. Removing her from the HOA board was just the beginning. I was going to make sure she faced real legal consequences. The morning after the chaotic meeting, I met with my attorney again. He was already compiling a case against the HOA, but after reviewing everything, he had an even bigger idea. "You don't just have them on fraud," he said. "If we dig a little deeper, we might be able to make the case for complete dissolution of the HOA." I leaned forward in my chair. "You mean, get rid of it entirely?" He nodded. "If we can prove systemic corruption, financial mismanagement, and a pattern of illegal activity, a judge could rule to dissolve the HOA altogether. It's not easy, but given how blatantly Karren ignored the bylaws, we have a strong foundation." I didn't even hesitate. "Let's do it." I had already spent too much time dealing with Karren's antics. The HOA had been a nightmare for years, and now that we had the chance to get rid of it once and for all, I wasn't about to let it slip away. But if we were going to pull this off, we needed more evidence. I spent the next week gathering every document, email, and financial statement I could get my hands on. Karren had ruled over the HOA like a dictator for years, and it didn't take long to uncover just how deep her corruption ran. The missing funds were the first major red flag. A quick audit of the HOA's finances conducted by a few residents who had accounting backgrounds revealed discrepancies in the budget. Tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had been collected, but there were no records of where the money had gone. Even more suspicious, several payments had been made to a company that didn't seem to exist. It didn't take much digging to figure out why. The so-called company was registered under Karren's maiden name. She had been funneling HOA funds into her own fake business. That alone was enough to get the courts involved, but the deeper we looked, the worse it got. Residents came forward with horror stories, fabricated fines, selective enforcement of rules, threats of foreclosure for minor infractions. One elderly couple had nearly lost their home after Karren slapped them with thousands in bogus penalties for violating landscaping guidelines. She had been running the HOA like her own personal racket, and she had gotten away with it for years. Until now. With all this evidence in hand, my attorney filed a lawsuit on behalf of the homeowners. Not only were we demanding a full financial audit, but we were also seeking to have the entire HOA dissolved. When Karren was served with the lawsuit, she finally realized just how much trouble she was in. She tried to rally her former allies, but most of them had already abandoned her. The few who remained loyal were either implicated in the fraud or too scared to speak out. At the first court hearing, she showed up with a lawyer who looked like he regretted taking the case the second he walked into the courtroom. The judge didn't waste time. After reviewing the evidence we presented, including financial records, testimony from homeowners, and proof of fraudulent activity, he ruled in favor of a full forensic audit. Karren turned pale as the judge laid out the consequences. If the audit confirmed what we suspected, not only would she be facing civil penalties, but criminal charges were also a real possibility. She tried to play the victim, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she had only ever acted in the best interest of the community. The judge wasn't buying it. The audit took weeks, but when the final report came in, it was worse than even I had anticipated. Karren had embezzled over $200,000. She had used HOA funds to renovate her home, pay off personal debts, and even take luxury vacations. The fake company was just the tip of the iceberg. She had been siphoning money through multiple fronts, covering her tracks with falsified invoices and bogus expenses. With this mountain of evidence, the judge made his final ruling. The HOA was officially dissolved. All outstanding fines and fees imposed under Karren's leadership were declared null and void. Homeowners who had been wrongfully charged were entitled to refunds, and Karren herself was ordered to pay restitution. But that wasn't the worst of it for her. With the audit findings in hand, the district attorney's office launched a criminal investigation. Within a month, Karren was arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. The woman who had once lorded over our neighborhood like a tyrant was now facing prison time. The day she was taken away in handcuffs, the entire neighborhood gathered to celebrate. For the first time in years, we were free. No more arbitrary fines, no more ridiculous rules, no more power-hungry HOA board. People repainted their homes, put up fences, planted gardens, things Karren had once forbidden. The community thrived without her, and as for me, I had never felt more satisfied. Justice had been served. With Karren out of the picture and the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. People were finally free to make their own decisions about their homes without the constant fear of fines or harassment. Some residents immediately began renovating, fixing up their properties in ways Karren had never allowed. Vibrant paint colors replaced the dull beige she had mandated, and flower beds sprang up in yards that had once been kept barren under her strict landscaping rules. But even with the HOA gone, there was still unfinished business. The forensic audit had exposed just how deeply Karren had abused her position, but it also revealed something that left all of us stunned: she hadn't acted alone. Buried in the financial records were payments made to several former board members, disguised as consultation fees and community development grants. In reality, they were kickbacks bribes Karren had paid to keep certain people loyal to her regime. These individuals had knowingly helped her enforce illegal fines and manipulate financial records, all while lining their own pockets. It was obvious that if we wanted real justice, we couldn't stop at just Karren. Several of us, including Peter and a few other longtime residents, met with the district attorney's office to discuss what could be done. Since the investigation was still ongoing, they assured us that additional charges could be filed if more wrongdoing was uncovered. That was all the encouragement we needed. Determined to expose every corrupt board member, we started digging deeper. Former residents who had moved away due to Karren's oppressive rule came forward with stories of extortion and intimidation. One family had been forced to sell their home after the board hit them with thousands in fabricated fines. Another homeowner had been denied access to community amenities despite paying dues for years. The worst part, the money Karren had stolen wasn't just from fees, it included funds that were supposed to be used for neighborhood repairs. The community playground, which had been falling apart for years, should have been maintained with HOA funds. Instead, Karren and her allies had pocketed the money, leaving the equipment rusting and unsafe for children. Armed with this new information, we submitted everything to the district attorney's office. It didn't take long before subpoenas were issued for the former board members who had taken part in the scheme. One by one, they were summoned for questioning, and it quickly became clear that some of them were willing to turn on Karren to save themselves. One of the former treasurers, a man named Bill, was the first to crack. He admitted that Karren had personally instructed him to falsify financial records, ensuring that no one outside the board knew how much money was truly being collected or where it was going. Another board member, Linda, revealed that Karren had pressured her into signing off on fake meeting minutes to justify fee increases that had never been properly voted on. With their testimonies, the case against Karren and her inner circle became airtight. Within weeks, additional charges were filed, not just against Karren but against 3 of her former board members. They were all implicated in fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The district attorney made it clear that they would be seeking maximum penalties, given the extent of the damage they had caused. The trial was set to begin, and while we waited, the neighborhood continued to rebuild. Without the HOA's interference, we organized our own community projects, something Karren had always claimed was impossible without her leadership. Volunteers came together to finally repair the neglected playground, and local businesses chipped in to help with materials. It was incredible to see how quickly things improved once Karren and her cronies were out of the way. The fear that had once hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by a sense of unity and determination. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now working side by side, proving that a strong community didn't need an oppressive HOA to function. As the trial date approached, Karren tried to play the victim in the press. She gave a disastrous interview to a local news station, claiming she had been unfairly targeted and that everything she had done was to protect property values. But the public wasn't buying it. The overwhelming evidence against her was impossible to ignore, and the comments on the news article were brutal. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed with current and former residents eager to see justice served. The prosecution laid out every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated document, every homeowner who had suffered under Karren's rule. Witness after witness testified against her, including former board members who had flipped in exchange for reduced sentences. Karren's defense crumbled almost immediately. She tried to shift the blame, claiming she had simply been misled by the people around her, but the paper trail told a different story. Every fraudulent transaction had her signature on it. Every fake fine had been personally approved by her. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. When the verdict was announced guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Karren was sentenced to prison, along with two of her most corrupt board members. Others who had been involved received probation and hefty fines, forced to pay back the money they had stolen. It was the kind of justice that didn't just punish the guilty, but also sent a clear message to anyone who might try something similar in the future. With the trial over, the neighborhood could finally move forward without the shadow of the corrupt HOA hanging over it. For the first time in years, people felt truly free in their own homes. As I walked through the neighborhood, seeing kids playing on the newly restored playground and homeowners proudly displaying decorations Karren would have banned, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. We had won, and we had done it together. With the trial behind us and Karren locked away, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one free from the constant surveillance and oppression of the old HOA. People were thriving, and the sense of relief was almost tangible. Without the looming threat of arbitrary fines, homeowners finally felt safe making their own decisions. But just when we thought we could put everything behind us, a new problem emerged, one Karren had left behind, like a trap waiting to spring. It started with a letter from the county. A few of us, including Peter and some of the other residents who had been active in the fight against the HOA, received notices stating that several of our properties had liens registered against them. At first, we thought it was some kind of clerical error. After all, with the HOA dissolved, there shouldn't have been any outstanding fines or dues left to claim. But when we looked deeper, we discovered something that turned our stomachs. Karren had secretly filed liens against multiple homes before she was removed from power. The worst part: the liens had been disguised as unpaid community assessments, meaning they had been quietly registered with the county without homeowners being immediately notified. In other words, Karren had found a way to keep her claws in the neighborhood even after her downfall. If we didn't fight this, homeowners could be forced to pay thousands in fraudulent fees or, even worse, face foreclosure. It was clear that Karren had left this as a final act of spite. Even from behind bars, she had managed to leave behind a mess designed to cause as much damage as possible. The first thing we did was call an emergency meeting with the residents who had been affected. We gathered in the community center, the same place where we had first confronted Karren, and spread out the documents. It was worse than we had initially thought. Nearly 20 homes had been hit with these bogus liens. Some were for a few $1,000s, others for much more. The frustration in the room was palpable as homeowners realized they were still dealing with the fallout of Karren's corruption. People were angry, but more than that, they were worried. Some of the older residents, those on fixed incomes, couldn't afford a legal fight. Others were already struggling financially and feared what might happen if the liens weren't removed. We needed a plan, and fast. Peter reached out to a property attorney he knew, someone who specialized in fraudulent claims. When we explained the situation, he agreed to take a look. Within a few days, he confirmed what we had suspected: the liens were completely illegitimate. Karren had signed off on them without proper board approval, and they had been filed under the HOA's name even after the HOA had been dissolved. Legally, they shouldn't exist. But getting rid of them wouldn't be as simple as pointing that out. Because they had been officially recorded, we would need to go through the court system to have them nullified. That meant filing a lawsuit against Karren's fraudulent filings and proving that they were unenforceable. It wasn't going to be easy, but we had already taken her down once. We weren't about to let her win now. We pooled our resources and hired the attorney to represent the group. He filed a motion with the court to have the liens removed, citing the illegality of Karren's actions. The process took weeks, but as we waited, more information came to light. Karren hadn't acted entirely alone. While she had been the mastermind, the records showed that a former board member, someone who had managed to escape charges during the trial, had played a role in filing the liens. This person, a man named Roger, had been in charge of handling property disputes under Karren's administration. He had personally signed off on many of the fraudulent filings, making sure they slipped through unnoticed. Roger had kept his head down when the HOA was dissolved, likely hoping that no one would notice his involvement. But now that we had uncovered his role, we weren't about to let him walk away unscathed. With this new information, our attorney amended the lawsuit to include Roger, holding him accountable for his role in the scheme. When he was served with the legal notice, he panicked. Unlike Karren, who had been arrogant enough to fight until the bitter end, Roger immediately tried to cut a deal. Through his lawyer, he admitted his involvement and agreed to provide full documentation on how the liens had been processed, including evidence that Karren had ordered them to be filed even after the HOA had been dissolved. This was the final piece of the puzzle we needed. With Roger's cooperation, the court quickly ruled in our favor, declaring all the liens null and void. Not only that, but Roger was ordered to pay damages to the affected homeowners. He had managed to avoid criminal charges, but financially, he was ruined. With the liens officially removed, the last remnants of Karren's influence were finally erased. The relief in the neighborhood was overwhelming. People who had been on the verge of losing their homes could finally breathe again. The sense of victory was even sweeter than before because this time, we had caught the problem before it could do real damage. As for Roger, he quietly moved out of the neighborhood, unable to face the people he had betrayed. His house sat empty for months before it was finally sold, a stark reminder of what happened to those who tried to exploit their neighbors. With the last legal battle behind us, the neighborhood truly began to heal. People started new traditions, hosting block parties and community events that had never been possible under Karren's rule. The playground, which had once been neglected under the old HOA, became a gathering place for families. The rigid, sterile atmosphere that Karren had enforced was gone, replaced with something real, a true community, built on trust and cooperation rather than fear and control. For the first time in years, we were free. And this time, there was no one left to take that away from us. With the last of Karren's damage undone, the neighborhood finally felt like it belonged to the people again. The relief was undeniable. People no longer had to tiptoe around ridiculous regulations or worry about surprise fees appearing in their mailboxes. The fear that had once gripped the community had been replaced with a new sense of ownership, one that stretched beyond individual houses and into a shared responsibility for making the neighborhood better. But there was still one final piece left to deal with: what to do with the now defunct HOA office. For years, Karren had operated out of a small but well-furnished building at the entrance of the neighborhood. It was meant to be a simple administrative center, but under her rule, it had become a fortress of intimidation. Residents had been summoned there to be reprimanded over trivial violations, or worse, pressured into paying fines that never had any real basis. Now, with the HOA dissolved and Karren gone, the building sat empty, a relic of the past that no one wanted to deal with. Initially, there was talk of selling it, but the idea didn't sit well with many of us. The money wouldn't go back to the neighborhood since the HOA no longer officially existed, and there was no telling what kind of business might take over the space. Some suggested turning it into a community center, but the memories tied to the building made it an unappealing choice. Then Peter, always one for straightforward solutions, made a suggestion that caught everyone off guard: tear it down. At first, the idea seemed extreme, but the more people thought about it, the more it made sense. The building wasn't just an eyesore, it was a reminder of everything Karren had done to the community. Keeping it standing would always tie us to the past, and none of us wanted that, so we took a vote. Every homeowner had a say, and the decision was nearly unanimous: the building had to go. Demolition Day turned into a full-fledged neighborhood event. Families brought out lawn chairs, kids waved homemade signs celebrating the downfall of the HOA, and people even set up snack tables like it was a festival. When the bulldozer arrived, cheers erupted through the crowd. The first hit to the building's structure sent dust into the air, and people clapped as the walls that had once held so many unjust rulings crumbled into rubble. It felt symbolic, like we were physically dismantling the last remnants of Karren's rule. As the structure came down, a sense of finality settled over the community. This was it. The last piece of her influence was gone for good. With the lot now empty, the neighborhood had a blank slate. Instead of letting it sit unused, the residents came together and decided to turn it into something meaningful. After weeks of planning, fundraising, and volunteer work, the space was transformed into a public garden. Where Karren's office had once stood was now a vibrant, thriving space filled with flowers, benches, and walkways. People took pride in maintaining it, and it became a gathering place that symbolized everything the HOA had tried to suppress: freedom, cooperation, and a true sense of community. As the months passed, the neighborhood only grew stronger. Without the HOA micromanaging every aspect of people's lives, homeowners found they were more than capable of handling things on their own. Disputes were settled between neighbors instead of through fines, and improvements were made through collective effort rather than forced mandates. It was the kind of neighborhood people actually wanted to live in, not because they were forced to follow a set of arbitrary rules, but because they genuinely cared about their homes and each other. One evening, as I walked through the garden, I spotted Peter sitting on one of the benches, watching as a group of kids played nearby. He looked at the space with quiet satisfaction, then turned to me with a knowing nod. We had done it. We had taken back our neighborhood, and this time it was ours to keep.